Mark Robinson, who is going to talk to us about critical race theory. He, right now, is teaching part-time at Trinity Christian School. He also teaches a course at Reformed Presbyterian Theological Seminary. He's written various articles in different publications, Gospel Coalition being one that I remember right off, and other places. Mentioned this morning, he's also an accomplished musician. And prior, he was an assistant pastor in Redeemer, North Carolina, New York City, under Tim Keller. But so close, slightly different. North Carolina, New York City. Anyway, welcome, Mark.
This is supposed to be the hardcore game who takes a Sunday afternoon to listen to a talk on CRT. Wow. Okay. So I'm not an expert on this by any means, but I think I have decent pastoral instincts and a shepherd's eye to see currents and movements of things, and I'm an extremely curious person who likes to read a bunch of stuff and think about it. So, let me say this first is I think about this from the perspective of the church, not just of some abstract kind of theory and ideology in society, but from the perspective of the church. And the Church of Jesus Christ never needs to undergo moral panic about what's going on in the world outside of it. Jesus' church will triumph. It will succeed at the end of history. Jesus sees the travail of the seat of his soul, and he'll be satisfied. And his bride will be presented as a pure bride. So there's no real threat against the church in terms of its ultimate destination. So no need to have moral panic over any threat against the church, but also neither should there be passivity. The victory of Christ means that we fight with an assurance that victory is ours because Christ has already won and he will win in history. So we always have to walk that path of not being engaged in moral panic, moral passivity in the face of things that come against the church. Right? So let me start. We'll talk about it. So we're talking about CRT, but the real problem. I don't want to just rabbit on and on. I literally want us to talk together. So the real problem, though, isn't CRT per se. When we talk about this, that's not the problem. Critical race theory is this relatively isolated legal field discipline and kind of set of ideas that was formulated in the academy. Its two most prominent formulators were Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw. Was formulated by them. What precipitated that was their desire to see more black law professors in a post-civil rights era. So in the 70s, 80s, we were 10, 15 years post-civil rights, and they believed that there was a loss in some of the gains they had seen. And they're like, well, in one of the areas is we're law professors and we don't see a whole bunch of black people. And, so really they just had this practical concern that precipitated them, critically looking at the law and bringing all kinds of presuppositions to it, things that I'll spell out a little bit. So that was their desire, and it was a kind of isolated thing. It has grown, of course, over time. So I wouldn't say the real problem that we in the church as believers face is directly critical race theory, though it's definitely related. You know what the problem is? The problem is Christians who are being seduced away from the simplicity, sincerity, and purity of the gospel story. Paul talks about to the Corinthians, he says, don't be seduced away from the simplicity, sincerity of the gospel. The real problem is believers acquiescing instead of destroying godless arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God. there are lots of godless opinions, lofty arguments, empty wisdom that raises itself against the true knowledge of God. CRT is just one of those, right? That's a problem. And instead, we should be taking every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. Every belief, every theory belongs to Him. We need to think those things out along those lines, right? And we have a failure at the level of some other words Paul says. He tells the Colossians, see to it that no one takes you captive by philosophy and empty deceit, according to human tradition, according to the elemental spirits of the world, and not according to Christ. See to it, believers, that no one takes you captive by philosophy and empty deceit. There's a lot of those kinds of things. See, if it isn't CRT, if it isn't critical race theory, then it would be some other worldly wisdom, some other empty deceit, right? The first century was Gnosticism. The first couple centuries of the church had fight Gnosticism, this belief in secret knowledge, right? Third century, Arianism, attacks on the deity of Christ, that he was semi-God, not God. So they had to hash that out until Nicaea in the first part of the 4th century, right? We could point out a whole bunch of other isms. Right? Right now, in our context, one of the things we're dealing with in the modern day evangelical context, one of the big threats we have is an insidious racial ideology, amongst some other things. And so I've titled this, I call it, Who Has Bewitched You? Waking Up Without Being Woke. So the question that Paul, and of course, who is bewitched is the question that Paul posed to the Galatians, who were being seduced in their day by a sort of Jewish evangelical mishmash that said you follow Christ, but you had to get circumcised. So you really had to become Jewish to become Christian, right? Who has bewitched you? That's a perennial question that the church asks. And that's my concern. Why are we getting bewitched and seduced by these faddish racial ideologies and corrupted away from the simplicity and sincerity of the gospel story? I want to spell it out, but I want to just lay that out there. The issue is our seduction away from the truth of the gospel, to get caught up. Right? So that's a perennial question. Who has bewitched us? How do we get bewitched? I promise I'm going to spell out some of the ideas so we can look at right at them of kind of critical race theory and critical race theory adjacent kinds of things. But how are we getting bewitched? I think there's a couple different ways. So there's a way into the particular subject. Let me lay out an example of the seductive power of these kind of neo-racism ideas. How people get seduced, right? So recently I was preaching at a friend's church down in the South. And while visiting there, I had dinner with one of his elders. One of his elders and his wife, the elder's wife. And that elder and his wife over dinner took occasion, because I'm black, right? And they were, this stuff, you have to note this kind of stuff when we're talking about these issues, so don't get offended when I'm noting color. We're talking about race and color, right? So black preacher, there's a white elder and his wife. They wanted my view on some of this race stuff. Here's particularly what they wanted my view on. He was asking me about some matters regarding a family that had recently left their church. And here's some of the circumstances. I can't quite recall everything he said. So on the Sunday after George Floyd's death, remember George Floyd? We were burning down cities. Right? So the Sunday after that happened, the pastor of the church, my friend, was a white pastor, right? He got up and preached, and he said nothing about what happened, right? He said nothing, right? Everybody was starting to burn down cities and things, but he just preached the gospel. He said nothing about it at all. And that offended a family in the church. This was a white family. It offended them. Now later the pastor, when I was talking with the pastor about it, my friend, He told me that, he didn't say anything about it, even though it had grabbed national headlines and everything. He didn't say anything about it because he didn't know exactly what happened. He didn't have all the facts on the ground, So he didn't say anything. And he told me about another case that he actually had said things about that he thought was patently unfair, but that was after a bunch of data came out, right? So he didn't speak to something he didn't really know. Didn't have all the facts. So that happened, right? That's one event, that family got offended. There may have been some other things that they already had in the background, but that was the most salient. So also at some other point, around that time, the mayor of Chicago, Lori Lightfoot, right? She went and got her hair done at a salon or something, right? It was a, COVID provisions for thee, but not for me, kind of thing, right? And that, some people, that became a big deal because some of these leaders and politicians were really severely locking down their people, but they were doing their own thing, right? So after that happened, my friend, I guess he wrote on social media or something, perhaps a little unadvisedly or ill-advisedly, he said, something to the effect that Mayor Lightfoot's appearance did not appreciably get better after her haircut. Right? Something to that effect. And of course, he's a white guy. Mayor Lightfoot is a black woman. This offended that family. They're offended by that. Right? This is the moment we live in. This kinds of things really, they get to people. This is sensitive stuff, right? And at that point, I think he sent a letter to the session and detailed some of the issues. Some other things transpired, I believe, little things that I can't remember what they were, but to my mind, they were similar to some of this kind of stuff. And then that man eventually, after sending that letter, sat down, and I guess the elders wanted to meet with him to kind of hear his concerns. He sat down, met with him over these issues. And the basic claim, the basic accusation from that family, the father of the family, to the session was, you guessed it, the church is racist. Right? He said the church is racist. He didn't say anything about this high-profile death at the hands of police. You made fun of a black woman who was a mayor. So you're racist. And the elder, who's very sober-minded, very wise and godly, said back roughly to the gentleman, okay, would you give us some proof? What's happening? Something happened in the church? Did you see something go down? Give us some proof. Tell me what happened, right? And the man mentioned those incidents, among others, like occurrences, and then I guess would just repeat the accusation. The church is racist. You have deep-seated racism here. Maybe you're not perceiving it, you don't see it, but you're racist. And the couple, at that point, the wife said, okay, I can think of maybe a few things in the life of the church since I've been here that were racist. One was they had a Valentine's banquet, there was an interracial couple there, and some couple or family made a comment about interracial couples. That was one thing, and nobody was approving of it. It was a passive comment or something, and that family may have not even been at the church still. In another instance, I guess, someone made a Southern joke about race relations. Those were the only two incidents she could remember of any racial nature. And one has been ambiguous, the joke. Is this derogatory toward black Southerners or black people or whatever the case may be. When she told me what the joke was, I had never even heard the terms of the joke, so I couldn't speak to, it was parochial to the South in any case. So eventually that family, going back to the family that wrote the letter, that the session, they left the church over these claims. And I was told that at the time I was down there visiting, which was sometime after they left, I can't remember the exact time frame. At that time, they were at another church, and the father was leading midweek Bible studies. And the topic du jour at that moment that he was teaching was teaching people how to repent of their whiteness. Right? That's what he was doing. So notice a few things here. I gave that extended example because I want us to as an entree into some of this. Notice a few things about it, right? So he called his former church racist, right? On the basis of what, in large part on the basis of what the pastor didn't say, or didn't. Right? He didn't condemn the death of George Floyd as somehow indicative of systemic racism. He didn't condemn it, right? The police force. In other words, an argument from an allegedly conspicuous silence was the ground of his allegation of racism. Racism wasn't, in that case, some overt act of animus on the basis of race, like it used to be considered, you know? If you spit on a black person and you called them a derogatory name, or you treated them explicitly unfair, unjust ways simply on the basis of their race, right? Those were the kinds of things that were classically considered racism. But that wasn't the case here, right? Racism was functioning in that particular example, and I could name a whole bunch of other examples like that, where those kinds of incidents led to racist allegations. It was functioning more like a kind of Gnostic insight, like a secret kind of knowledge that the woke possess, as it were. Woke meaning you're enlightened, you're aware of something that maybe most people are in the dark about. Like, it functioned like that, some kind of secret knowledge that only the woke can see. Also notice that it was non-empirical. Not something you could bring to a court as evidence and admit and adjudicate over, right? As evidence in the court of law. In other words, the racism in that case had migrated from something clearly external to some mystical internal kind of thing that you can't really see just with the naked eye. It's also unfalsifiable. You accuse somebody of racism on that basis, how do you argue against that? The session was dumbfounded. This elder was really trying to wonder, what's the issue here? Like, he was really dumbfounded that they were being called racist. It's like, what did we do? Right? You know, am I racist and I just don't know it? Right? It was an unfalsifiable claim that could not be discredited or disproven. You just had to see it and know it. Right? You had to have some special powers of intuition to really grasp it. And I'm not even saying that that isn't the case sometimes. I'm just saying in this particular case, you couldn't. It was non-rational. It wasn't subject to argument. You couldn't use logic and reason to kind of arrive at a kind of conclusion about it. It was just something else, right? But nevertheless, to the family that was making the accusation, it was very real. It was very real. And I don't doubt the validity of their feeling about it. It was very real to them, even though it was unfalsifiable, non-empirical, kind of Gnostic in terms of secret, but very real, strong enough that he picked up his family and left the church. Right? So that's this kind of race-conscious thinking, you know, if we can call it that, it works like a psychic virus that affects the mind and soul, incapacitating the host, right? Their ability to be reasonable and objective, only reactively subjective, and even resentful. I've seen people get really resentful when they define racism of this kind of sort and don't want to even talk about it. It's emotional, right? It's not subject to like reasonable pursuit, good faith kind of discussion to say, is this really going on, right? And I think that gentleman and his family, right, mentioned, I think they are an example of how Christians often get bewitched into some of the critical race theory things that are active. I think that's a classic example. I could name a bunch of cases that are similar like that again. But I would say many people are getting bewitched into it for entirely understandable reasons. I think I get, in large part, not totally, there's all kinds of reasons, but I think I get a lot of the reasons, a lot of why people do get seduced into it. Let me just give a couple instances, or two reasons, I think. One, I'd say there's a capturing of our sentiments And what I mean is this reflexive, uncritical empathy is something that is very hospitable, I think, to the kinds of beliefs that CRT embodies. Here's what happens: a sensationalized, visceral event that has all the proper race optics. A black man violently killed by a white man in authority. Right? So it gets sensationalized and projected over the screens constantly with certain commentary that builds it up. Right? And what happens when certain kinds of people see that? Their sentiments get captured, right? Their compassion jumps into gear. Their extreme empathetic faculties kick in, bypassing the critical faculties, right? Isn't it amazing how critical race theory can be? It just seems so uncritical. There's a lot of sentiment that gets in. And so what happens is they get seduced into this seeing a very powerful connection with this prescribed narrative of racial injustice. Even though you have very few facts when these events go down the road, you have very few facts. But you get seduced, your sentiments get captured, your desire to see justice. Because have you noticed, like, critical race theory and the kinds of things that attend it and surround it, the increase of it depends a lot upon these highly publicized shootings. I mean, it gains traction every time you have one of these shootings with the proper racial optics. Trayvon Martin, 2012. Michael Brown, 2014, I think. Right? George Floyd, 2020. And that mass hysteria that surrounds it, in which people get caught up, is like a kind of intoxicant. It stupefies people into just racing to join the cause. Right? I mean, I myself have felt these very things over the years. And I see it in other people. They just kind of get possessed with this desire to right a perceived or felt wrong. I don't see that as true classic social justice. We could talk about that later. I call it sentimental justice. It's a desire for justice. I think there's a proper good instinct that's at work there, but it's not grounded in reality. Clear-cut, real cases of injustice where we have sufficient facts to make a conclusion. It's grounded in just this kind of sentimental response to what may be an act of injustice or even racial injustice. I just see people getting a spell cast on them. And they just respond. And you say, what happened? And they'll give an interpretation. They won't give a recounting of the facts. It's an interpretation and they don't have enough facts to conclude that. Right? So I think there's a capturing of sentiments that draws people into this, that seduces people. Therefore, if you are an empath, if you're like somebody who just really responds to pain instinctively, your faculty of compassion is very high, you have got to be very careful. You've got to be very discriminating, not promiscuous with your emotional sentiments and your compassion. Right? When you're deeply identified, you're the type that really just instinctively, deeply identifies with a cause before it's even been evaluated, you got to realize that feeling right is not the same thing as being right. And besides, God has made us with mind, will, and emotions. So to be led by your emotions is not to actually really engage the world the way God wants us to. We can't have it bypassing our cognitive faculties and our volitional faculties. So we really get at the truth by employing all the faculties God has given us, not just an uncritical emotional reaction or sentimental kind of engagement. So I think that's a really key way. I've seen people just get captured, and I sit down and try to talk with them, and they can't explain, they can't ground it in any like real facts or evidence or anything. It's just more, ooh, it just looked bad, it feels bad, potentially it is bad, I'm on the cause. Right? So that's more capture sentiments. There's another way I think we get seduced, not unrelated to that first one. I call it vulnerable virtue. The vulnerably virtuous. I saw this quote, and it just jumped out at me online. It said, "Wokeness preys upon a person's desire to be a good person and the vulnerabilities associated with thinking they may not be." I think that's true. There are, and I have no doubt there are people in here like this, there are many people for whom the thought that they might be racist, even unintentionally, the thought is so crushingly abhorrent. I mean, when this whole last episode kind of went off around George Floyd, I've had tender-hearted friends call me and text me in tears, thinking that they may have perpetuated some racial harm on me at some point in their life. And there are a lot of people like that. The thought that these friends of mine would have perpetuated racial harm because society is saying just being white you do, tore them to pieces. So, if there is even a remote possibility that racism is behind some local or national incident, even some remote possibility that that cop in Minneapolis was acting out of racial animus, right? If there's even a real possibility, there's a lot of people, the vulnerably virtuous, who don't want to be on the wrong side of that. They don't want to be standing with racists. That's almost like it's like almost being accused of being a pedophile. Because they have such a deep desire to be virtuous in this way. To not be prejudiced against their neighbor, especially on something like race, right? On the basis of something like race. Right? And I say that desire to be virtuous and non-racist can make you vulnerable to just jumping on a bandwagon because you don't want to be on the wrong side here. And so even if there's a real possibility, you dive in, right? Because being woke in that moment seems like a proper virtue, seems like good enlightenment, right? You don't want to be like a chattel slave owning forebearer from the South. You want to be virtuous and righteous, right? So I think people get on that because they really don't want to be, they just don't want to be in any way associated with or accused of being anything other than righteous and virtuous. All right, so what are some of these ideas? What are some of the ideas and practices that are tied up in what people mean by CRT, critical race theory, right? What defines it? Wokeness. Wokeness is just kind of an urban language, urban term for the stuff associated with critical race theory largely. It was disassociated from it beforehand, but it's kind of got taken up into that woke, being a light, being enlightened, right? Seeing, I can see. I'm down with what the man is trying to do. I'm down with the racial dynamics. I can see it. I'm not seduced by it. I get it, right? That's what people mean when they say they're woke. Well, what are some of the beliefs that are associated with this and make up? I would say there's a constellation of ideas and themes. This stuff gets mixed up. It's not always very clear and clean, but you can find this constellation of themes that kind of mutate through different movements like Marxism that draws heavily from some of the foundational tenets around Marxism, neo-Marxism, which was later, intersectionality. In fact, a lot of people associate critical race theory with intersectionality because Kimberly Crenshaw was on the ground. She's the one, famous for kind of developing intersectionality, and she was on the ground and talking about critical legal studies and critical race theory back in 80s. Frankfurt School Cultural Marxism, which has got some big influence from scholars who were in Frankfurt, Germany, and moved over to Columbia University in the 60s, I believe, and were perpetuating that kind of Marxism that works in an American context. They couldn't get the class warfare because our middle classes just was too big at the time, so they had to migrate it to color and to gender and some of these other kinds of divisions that were in society. Some of the ideas are there. Some forms of liberation theology, I'd say most forms of liberation theology, have some of these ideas I'm about to articulate. And something I would call applied postmodern social justice, which is different than social justice at the turn of the 20th century, even the social justice that dominated up through the civil rights movement. I would say that was fundamentally different than this form of applied postmodern social justice that's at work today. There's also post-colonialism, some of the group identitarianism, identity politics, this kind of like policy according to group identity as opposed to individual rights. A lot of this stuff brings with it some of these assumptions that are key to critical race theory. What are those? There are a lot. Let me just give a few key ones, and I'll flush out some examples. And I'll talk about some of the language that you see which really mask these kinds of assumptions too. All right, here's one. The belief that, and this might be the bedrock one for critical race theory, the belief that racism, in the particular case of critical race theory, it's usually thinking black to white black, though I think they've moved to embrace people of color. You gotta make the enemy bigger, right? That racism is pervasive, normal, constitutive of the DNA of society. Right? Foundational, not aberrational, it's normal. You should expect racism to be behind the institutions, the movements of society, the decisions that the majority make. Right? That's kind of its most fundamental assumption. That it's just, racism is the normal way society does business. You see it, here's an eminent example of that belief in, you're familiar with the 1619 Project, Nicole Hannah-Jones. She won a Pulitzer for that. Her baseline belief that she espoused was that America is founded upon race-based chattel slavery. That's the reason it exists, she said. Now, she had a bunch of historians take her to task. But basically, what she's arguing there, or she's not really making an argument so much as an assertion, is that our country, the United States, has just got racism down to the very core of its DNA from the very start. It was founded to be a slave colony, it's a collection of colonies, right? Not what is conventional and what the documents actually say. A place that espouses a certain form of liberty, of individual rights, grounded in nature, the way God made us and created us. No, it's grounded in the desire to perpetuate slavery, according to her. Right? Sometimes this fundamental point is framed in a Marxist way, to say, we have an almost ineradicable, though a lot of people will try to avoid that word because it would scare everyone away. Like, what's the point of doing anything if it's ineradicable? You can't change it. But that our society is a fixed oppressor-oppressed class. White people, the oppressor. Black people or people of color, the oppressed. That is the very social structure of things. that that's a social condition that in order to change requires revolution. Right? Marx believed you had to kill the bourgeoisie because nobody will give up their position out of the benevolence of their heart. Right? Takes revolution to change this fixed, oppressed class. Not reformation, revolution. Violence, right? Who was it? And you see some of this, even a woman like Robin DiAngelo, who's, makes $30,000 just to speak at the corporate HR function for 2 hours, right? Here's what she said. And this is a classic example of this first point, right? Racism is recognized as being embedded in all aspects of society and the socialization process. No one who is born into and raised in Western culture can escape being socialized to participate in these relations. It's ubiquitous, it's embedded in everything. It's like you can't go anywhere in society, you can't breathe American air without basically breathing in racism. Right? And everything you basically do is the fruit of it or is the actual expression of it. Racism, right? So, this belief that racism is just pervasive, universal, in effect infects every single thing in society. Right? It's kind of like the air we breathe is racism. That's a fundamental point. Here's the second point. Something called, the shorthand for it is interest convergence. And basically what that means is, so America's racist, right? Racist in favor of the majority of white people. So white supremacy is something that advantages the majority white class of people. Therefore, because it's advantageous, right? Because it brings benefits with it, the only time white people will do something for blacks or non-whites, the only time, is when that action serves white self-interest. So interest convergence. So you will do something that advantages black people only when it really advantages you as a white person. That's a fundamental point, right? And look, if you think out, like, what will that do? When you have that assumption, if you entertain that assumption that only time white people will do something that helps black people, that perceivably helps black people, is when it's really fundamentally helping them. Then you've basically effectively taken away from your social contract any possibility for interracial benevolence. And you just allow full-blown cynicism to kind of reign, right? Every gesture by white people is fundamentally racist. And that even when they're helping you, they're really helping themselves. So Derek Bell, here's an example, classic example. Derek Bell, one of the fathers, considered the grandfather of critical race theory. He's actually from Pittsburgh. He taught at NYU, I think at Harvard for a while. He believed that Brown versus Board of Education, 1954, which desegregated schools, he said that his belief was that was really just a result of elite white self-interest. That wasn't out of any benevolence to kind of like be fair and apply equal access. But that was really just elite white people somehow serving their self-interest, not any desire to help black people. I think a recent example of this, a stark one, is out in California, Larry Elder, right, famous, pretty well-known conservative black talk show host and author of things. He ran for governor in the recall election vote, California. Right, so he's a black man, and he's really, really, really conservative. Well, the Los Angeles Times put on their paper, I mean, it's almost comical. They said, this is Larry Elder, basically, right? The blackface of white supremacy. I thought it was funny. In other words, it couldn't be that they just really believed what this man was saying. And, no, it really was. This is just another way that white supremacy is pushing itself into our society by putting blackface on it. I probably shouldn't laugh at that.
Laugh or cry, pick one.
I know. White California residents who liked Elder really only were desirous to promote white supremacy. It had nothing to do with the beliefs the man was saying. It's just, let's make ourselves look good, but let's really push white supremacy by putting a blackface on it. It just, so there's just no possibility for honest motive, for true benevolence. It's always about white supremacy asserting itself, everything. So even when white people do something good, something truly just, truly benevolent, that benefits in material ways, not just sentimental ways, in material ways, non-black people, it's really just a way to perpetuate white supremacy, right? So that's a key point there. Another one, revisionist history. This is pretty straightforward, obviously, right? So U.S. history needs to be re-scrutinized and reinterpreted in light of the experience of black people of color, not the hegemonic white, right? So we have to look at history really closely. See, they're biased. There's always enough truth in a thing to kind of like take it and poison you. There's always a position. Everybody's biased. There's always a perspective, but it's not a monolithic race-based perspective. It's a perspective of the people who actually wrote history. There are certain white people who are given a different perspective. Anyway, so this revisionist history, right? So instead of supplementing history, which I would argue is a good thing, over time you just kind of discover, oh, we left out this. There's a lacuna in our historical awareness here. It's a good thing. That's the way we grow. But instead of supplementing a curriculum, a historical curriculum, no, you basically are burning books written by white people and putting forward what's basically revisionist accounts from a Marxist perspective. Right? That's essentially that is essentially what has happened. It is not an overstatement. This is happening in Pittsburgh. This is happening, Loudoun County, Virginia. Right in Pittsburgh, a couple of the northern suburban school districts, the parents are really upset because there's this revision of the curriculum undergoing, which is basically infusing some of these ideas, which are basically saying white people bad, black people virtuous. And if you don't like that, that just shows just how bad you are, right? And kids are coming home saying, why am I, that's happening all over the country in school districts. Revisionist history, that's CRT. When you see curriculum revision, adding these kinds of Marxist assumptions about white oppression, black oppressed, or people of color oppressed, that really is CRT stuff coming in. Now, sometimes it's not. Sometimes it really is, there's more judicious, like, you know what, we want to supplement what we believe is already a fairly accurate accounting of our history. Just want to supplement it with things we haven't generally talked about. Right? If a school introduces black history in a particular way, that's not CRT necessarily. If they subvert traditional historical accounts and say it was implicitly wrong and they see it viewed through the lens of an oppressor class and throw away all the documents which explicitly are grounded in a pursuit of liberty for all and a perfecting of a union and things like that, stuff which our history really bears out, then you're in CRT territory. And let me just give one more. So this whole lifting, this is related, a lot of these are kind of interrelated at particular junctures and points. This lifting up of voices, like voices of color, and their stories of black people, lifting up lived experience. Have you heard this phrase? Lived experiences. And imbuing them with an almost absolute authority. In other words, I look at the fruit of, like, so when you hold this belief that there's an inherent authority in minority voices, and they need to be heard, and they need to be centered, you'll hear that kind of language. You're basically saying the arguments and statements being made don't matter. It's the mouthpiece. Black people say a lot of stupid things. White people say a lot of stupid things too. But the stupidity doesn't depend upon the color of the person speaking it. There's nothing inherently authoritative about someone's voice on the basis of their color. I get that we have different experiences. This gets way down deep in the waters of epistemology, how we know things. But your color doesn't give you, inherently or intrinsically, some special revelatory knowledge about reality. It's not color-based. Thomas Chatterton Williams, I think, he's a brilliant writer living in France, he's from the U.S. He calls it, racial epistemology, like we know things on the basis of our color, is the underlying assumption. So, critical race theory wants to push that, wants to reinterpret the law in light of black experience. Not in light of whether the law works, praxeology, not in regard to whether the law is true and good, right? Classic kinds of virtue thinking, but whether or not it accords with minority experience, lived experience. That is not an absolute arbiter of what is true or not. There's so much behind it, but when you see this language of lived experience or the black voice, and again, of course, I've had experiences in life as a 6'3" African American that maybe are some ways different than people that are not that. If you're a 5'2" Swedish blonde-haired, blue-eyed woman, right? It doesn't make those experiences authoritative. In fact, I would dare say that most of our experience of humanity are more similar than they are different. And that the arbiter of a good experience is not the color, race, sex, class of the person who experiences it. That's not the arbiter. It doesn't judge. I mean, as a Christian, I'm going to say the law of God. What God says defines reality and experience. So this is a kind of experience-based kind of thinking that wants to revise law, change it in light of black people, the experiences of color, people of color. So narrative trumps reason, logic. This is why there's a guy who works for Ibram Kendi. You heard of Ibram Kendi? Ibram X. Kendi, big anti-racist advocate. I know a guy that works for him now. He's the assistant director of narrative. Because story, experience, is more authoritative than reason, facts. It makes everything subjective. Like like everything is subject to interpretation through personal lens, which is really a species of what's called postmodernity. Right? This belief that there's really no central narrative, no one truth that is true for all people at all times. But it's your truth, right? It's my truth, it's my experience, your experience. There's other points, there's a lot you can, those are just some key ones there, right? So that racism is pervasive, universal, just everywhere. Interest convergence, white majority only acts, even when they're seemingly doing something that materially profits non-white people, but it's always acting out of self-interest. Revisionist history, you have to subject our history, scrutinize it, and reinterpret it in light of the experience of people of color, black people. And this elevation and prioritization of voices of color. Narrative over kind of reason and logic, reinterpret law, reinterpret institutional goals and things in light of what the voices of color that have been suppressed. And there's we can keep going on that, but that's enough to kind of, here's some concepts where this stuff gets pushed, because it could be very arcane, it could be very obscure to talk about some of the tenets of critical race theory. But here's where you see it showing up. I mentioned some already, but you see it seeping into school curriculums, you see it That's happening in Pittsburgh, it's happening all over the country. Corporate culture, HR, right? You gotta take anti-racism training, anti-bias training, bias training, all this kind of stuff you gotta do in the corporate workplace. You see it in churches, parachurch organizations, Christian schools. There's a Christian school right in Pittsburgh where all the students in middle school, 6th grade I think, and their parents were to read Kendi. You want Kendi? Anti-racism. This is a Christian school, right? I could give so many other illustrations. Some of them still infuriate me to this day that I know personally, was personally involved with to some degree. You see it cloaked in the language of the unholy trinity of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Whenever you see the language of equity, it's not about allowing for equality of opportunity. Like just don't unfavorably bias or hinder anyone, but allow people to pursue opportunities. It's not that. It's morphed into equality of outcomes. The astrophysics department of MIT has 5 people or whatever. They're all 5 middle-aged white males. We need a woman, a minority. See, outcome, opportunity. It could be that it's mostly white males that love astrophysics. And other people like other groups like other things, given cultural dispositions and cultural conditioning, things like that, right? So it's a push for a certain kind of outcome, hard quota, a certain kind of diversity in result, not a removing barriers, any active barriers of opportunity. Right, so when you see that unholy trinity, you're really seeing kind of CRT adjacent beliefs in the background of it. Anti-racism, you see that word, anti-racism, you're dealing with racism. You're dealing with, you're dealing with some kind of program that is operating under these assumptions of critical race theory and the like. And if it hasn't been clear, let me just say very clearly here, and I'm just going to tease out one antidote to this because I could go on forever. This stuff is, in a very real way, it's not abstract theory, it is poisonous to the soul. It's a fundamental contradiction of the truth as it is in Christ. And CRT and all its related beliefs are on a collision course with the gospel and the gospel storyline. They can't go together. These assumptions about race are completely at odds with a Christian view of people, society, relating completely. In Christianity, sin is pervasive. It's universal, right? It's everywhere. But sins, like racism, aren't everywhere. Racism isn't as pervasive as sin itself. The sin of racism isn't coterminous with sin itself. Let me think about it. Is everyone a drunk? Is everyone a kleptomaniac? Has everybody stole something? Sins, particular sins, are not the same as sin in general. The reality of evil, iniquity, they're not coterminous. Racism isn't the original sin. I mean, just to be clear, it is a big sin in the history of our country. No one would deny that. I hope we can understand. It was a big sin, but it's not the original sin. The original sin was committed by our first parents, right? And so, anyway, so there's this ancient heresy called Manichaeanism. In part, that was giving moral qualities to physical things. Like it's a Manichaean thing to say that a TV is evil. A TV is a physical thing. Can't be evil. What comes out of it can be evil. So I think there's a racial Manichaeanism at work here that basically says white is bad. And people of color are innocent victims. That's just very, very deviant, aberrant anthropology. Paul says very clearly, in Adam, all sinned. All fell. So we can't say white people are particularly evil, and minorities, or especially anyone that's experienced oppression at the hands of a white majority, are particularly virtuous. You can't say that. Sinfulness, the sin of partiality, which is in large part what we're dealing with, goes all the way down and goes in all directions. The most racist people I know are some black people. Of course there's lots of racist white people. There are knuckleheads in every class and group of people, right? So this positing of this collective, that whiteness is something that needs to be repented of. I know one of the arguments that come back with often is, well, whiteness isn't about physical skin color, it's about a collective set of values at work in a system that was built up by European. But why don't you call it something else then? I mean, why call it by a color? If it's not about a color, why use color? Because all that does is just perpetuate conflict and things like that. If it's something else, call it that. I tend to use the language of every culture has a kind of majoritarian bias. The people of the biggest group is going to perpetuate its ideas more than the mind. That's just a numerical issue. So if we were all to transport over into Malaysia, it would be an Asian majoritarian bias, right? So this Manichaeanism is a violation of our Adamic federal theology, which says we've all fallen in Adam, and every sin can be committed by every class of people. There is no sin that is unique to some physical group. It might be more common, given cultural circumstances, but it is not unique and exclusive to that group, right? And then there's a crisis revolution storyline within the CRT. The way you change is a great reset. You have conflict that leads to revolution, and then you rebuild up. And if you look at the history of that, it is a bloody history. We really don't have an example of a country that has applied Marxism at its highest levels that flourishes. Look what happened to Venezuela. It used to be a flourishing country. Look what happens when they applied kind of Marxist, taking over the means of control, means of labor and production in society, and flowing through a kind of oligarchical or dictator. Look at Cuba. It just has never worked. Look at the collapse of the Soviet bloc in Eastern. It's just never, ever worked. It doesn't accord to our nature. Right? The biblical storyline resolves through regeneration, through reconciliation, through cultural reformation. Right? Christians build hospitals. There's just a whole different kind of structure. Right? It doesn't thrive through defunding authorities and tearing down systems or abolishing laws and things like that, right? I used to think that claim about Marxist-like ideas was surely overblown. Just think, what? No, it doesn't quite, no, but then you look at history, you go, oh, yeah, that's right. We have 120 years now. I mean, at some point, you would have seen a successful nation that runs and operates on these kinds of assumptions about oppressed class and oppressor. And we haven't. And also, look at this. I mean, this is very simple. Anywhere I have seen, and I challenge you to look for yourself, don't just believe me, look any place that applies these kinds of